So I want to talk to you a bit about how the left hates the West.
Shock.
It's a shock, yeah. So basically, one of the major issues is, I think, ideological thinking. Now, ideology can be understood in many ways. One way is you can say basically that your ideology is a system of ideas and you're trying to put all these ideas together and you can make sense of the world and what you're experiencing. And this is basically something that is fairly okay. There's nothing pejorative about it. But there's another issue when ideology becomes sort of like an algorithm in people's brains or in people's minds, and it prevents them from actually examining issues on their own. So, for instance, you know the famous saying that says that whenever facts clash with theory, so worse for the facts. That's ideology in a bad sense, in a nutshell.
It's a closed system of world interpretation that leads you to operate in erroneous ways. And then there's no self-correcting mechanism.
Exactly. There may be self-correcting in the sense like the Marxists did, for instance, when they were saying that utopia, the communist utopia will arrive in the next, let's say, 2-3 years. When it didn't, what they were saying was something like the historical moment wasn't ripe for evolution. So there is a kind of mechanism for self-correction, but it doesn't apply for the main tenets of that ideology.
Yeah, well, cope isn't self-correction.
Yeah, so but it is. If you look at the structure of thought that people who are coping are doing, that's essentially it. There are some axioms that they take for granted and they will never question.
Hi folks, we've rolled out a new feature on the website, which is the ability to pay for an individual piece of content. So usually it's £5 a month every month to subscribe to all of the content on the website. But I appreciate there are going to be people who simply don't want to do that. They would be interested instead in purchasing a single piece of content for a lower amount, and they've got a particular niche that they're interested in watching. And so they don't want every single piece of content. They just want this one thing. So we've introduced this function where you can just simply purchase the one thing for £1.89, which I think is about $2.30 at the current exchange rates. And then that's just yours forever. So there's no sort of commitment there. There's no rolling subscription. It's just that one thing. So that's an option now that's on the website. It's completely live. It's completely available. And please go and enjoy it. And we'll see you all very soon.
At least most of the SJWs never do this. And they may be able to work their way around it just in order to save these assumptions from any kind of empirical disconfirmation. So I want to show you this tweet here. It says, this isn't so much anti-Semitism as anti-Western civilization Marxism. Their argument, so to speak, is Western civilization, including Israel, is white and white is bad. So you see here this either or issue. You're either on the white or right side of history.
Marxism is kind of redundant in that sentence because Islamism and Marxism, I mean, Marx did say he would use the Muslims as a vanguard class against the Christians. However, they're not necessarily compatible and interreliant, and all of the nations in the right quadrant are Islamists.
Well, this is actually really insightful because there is basically no group that is allegedly protected by leftists that is compatible with other groups that are, again, allegedly protected by I was going to say Netflix.
Same at this point.
Well, I think the one driving force of the coalition groups of the left, of wokeism, if you want to call it that, is that they are all united against Western civilization and Western culture. That's the only thing. Even the ones that are made up of Westerners, like the LGBT movement, for instance, are fundamentally espousing an anti-Western ideology. That's why they group them all together, even though individually these groups would not get along well together.
Well, yeah, how are we grouped with France? I'm really offended.
So I think that this is very telling because it shows that basically these people, to a very large extent, the overwhelming majority, are thinking in a very ideologically. I mean, that's no surprise, but what this shows to a very large extent is that they don't approach issues on their own grounds. Okay, so for instance, let's say we have side A and side B. Okay, and there are 10, 20, 30 contentious issues. I think that the normal way is to examine each issue and focus on what we believe on each issue, and then you can judge who is correct about it. But this is not how ideologues operate. They are thinking in a top-down manner in the following sense. Who believes this? The people I like, therefore I'll believe that. And how many times have you heard leftists who can't give you arguments against your points, but they are telling you something like, well, do you know who agrees with you? Or do you know what kind of people embrace this kind of
Well, Nazis think that. That's the same way that Nazis think, because they associate all kinds of... Once again, as tying into the previous segment, this was something that was very much connected by psychoanalytic theory and Frankfurt, which was that any sort of repressive society, they saw, because of the fact that repression leads to psychosis and psychosis leads to you doing very nasty things, they see that any sort of repressive society, which they classify Western as, I don't know how they square the circle when they look at the other societies that they're representing there, but they see all Western societies repressive. If you repress people, they get psychotic, and if they get psychotic, they genocide.
I think I have an answer. And the question is, whenever we talk about repression, the question is who is repressed and why, and and who thinks is repressed. They are oppressed. Because there are lots of people who think they're oppressed in Western societies, and they're actually not. So the main question is, who thinks they are oppressed? And I think that essentially, we have a lot of people who are in the current left who don't have any positive vision. They know what they think they know what they're up against, but if you ask them what they want, they cannot really tell you. They can give you answers. I'm sure you can think of answers that they will give, but all of them are incredibly abstract. So, for instance, they will say things like, yeah, we want liberty, we want equality, we want social justice. But if you actually ask them, very few people are able to say exactly what this form will take. They may tell you equality of outcome, things like that. But all of that is usually abstract. So it's more like they are against something rather than being pro something else. And the question is whether the claim that they are completely oppressed by Western societies is basically just smokescreen for them actually saying, we need more political power. This is how we're going to achieve it. By mobilizing people under the banner of whatever ideal we are using.
You look like you had something to add there, Colin. Well, I don't want to take up time on your segment, but I don't think it's just I don't think it's power for power's sake. I think a lot of the time power is instrumental because what they're driving at, whether they know it or not, is the abolition of all constraints. In the same way that any form of structure, even advice, is an incursion that reminds them of their consciences when they're doing something bad. And so they want to abolish all cultural norms, all institutions, and achieve equality as the precondition for universality so that everyone can be free and equal to do whatever the hell they want. And that's just chaos.
Okay, so there's a good question here, and I don't have an answer. I think it's a good question to pose. Do they hate advice because they want more power?
No, I think they hate advice because it reminds them of their own insecurities. And so they want to abolish all standards so they don't feel as bad anymore.
But insecurities don't imply a feeling of powerlessness, in which case you could say that they really want power. They cannot accept the fact that they are limited and that they want the whole world to engage in a sort of dramatic act where everyone confirms them that they are essentially God's gift to human nature.
Sure, but I think the power there is the means, but the coercion and the accruing of resources is the means to the ends of total affirmation, so I don't feel as terrible anymore.
Okay. to be honest, I don't think that there is much of a contradiction there. I think we could definitely say that they could want both. But I'm more of a, you could say, of the political realist school. I think that basically more power is the goal. It's not any kind of liberation or something. They want liberation for themselves. So it's like we're going to talk about liberation for all, but in practice, it's liberation for me, but not for thee.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to add to this, which is I think that when you say what do they want, once again, these larger groups are made up of much smaller divided groups. If you were to ask a member of each of these individual groups, they would all give a different answer, because realistically, it's all about their group gaining more power so that they can have more control over their own selves and more control over those around us, so that they can not be impeded in what it is that they want. So once again, a lot of these right now are organized together because they're anti-white, anti-whiteness, whatever you want to call it. And the irony for me is looking at this sign here is that the governments of all of those in the coalition are typically the ones facilitating anti-whiteness within their own nations and have been acting in an anti-white manner for a long time at this point.
Also, Jews are like selectively put in the white category because don't they believe their own distinct ethnicity, and then they're conveniently labeled white by leftists who want to destroy.
That's a very large and complicated topic.
But I'm saying like the internal contradictions of even putting in that box is.
I think internally, many Jews, especially Israelis, do not consider themselves white. They consider themselves to be a very specific demographic and a very specific group with their own group interests. But among the broader intersectional lens that the left looks in, all they see when they see Israel is a Western outpost in the Middle East. That's all they see.
So I think we could we could introduce something else into the mix, which I think ties with what you said to an extent. There's a question, when you want power, what do you want to do with it? And you could say that traditionally speaking, when we are talking about moral precepts, there's the idea that you may have power. Are you going to use it for good or bad? So the kind of liberation from any kind of constraints that you're talking about seems to me here to be really relevant when it comes to liberation from moral constraints. That's what I think many of these people want psychologically. Why? Because morality, you could say, forms a kind of voice that tells people what they should do, and some people don't like it. Why? Because they want to use power in ways that are inconsistent with the, let's say, moral precepts we're talking about. Anyway, so I think that when we have lots of people, and I will say this primarily about people in Western societies, native people who hate their own societies, that's incredibly problematic. Okay, when we have a lot of people who are ecophobic, there's a question whether we are doomed. And to find out more about this question, you can check out our website for Symposium 41, Can Western Societies Survive? The symposium I did with Benedict Beckeld and David Thunder with respect to several problems afflicting Western societies.
We have contemplations coming out soon as well, where Bo, Josh, Carl, and I debate whether or not civilization is going to collapse. So
definitely give that a watch. And since we're on our website, we recently celebrated our 3rd birthday, and we have this fantastic opportunity. You can use code birthday for 33% off for the first 3 months. That's a lovely thing. A lovely offer. Okay, so there was an article here in Unheard by Samuel Rubinstein talking about the Gen Z has an Israel problem. And I want to share with you some statistics from here. It says, for years, young people have tended to be much more pro-Palestine and anti-Israel than their elders. According to a poll conducted a few months before Hamas's attack, American millennials are the first generation in history to sympathize with the Palestinian more than the Israelis. In Britain, 18 to 34-year-olds are also far more supportive of Palestinians, 23%, than the Israelis, only 7%, almost the precise inverse of the 55 to 75 years old. This being so, At universities across the countries, you will find students and academics calling for an intifada and tearing down posters of the kidnapped Israelis. Anyway, and here we say the noisiest activists most attract our attention, but the whirlpool also sucks in those rubberneckers who just want to know what mantra they have to intone today. Silence being violence is never an option. On all sorts of issues, you have to have a view. Here, intersectionality provides a solution. Instead of going through the laborious effort of selecting your stance on each issue a la carte, you can opt instead for the set menu. Climate justice is racial justice, is LGBTQ justice, is reproductive justice, is Palestinian justice. But intersectionality breeds conformity. If you dissent on any one of these issues, you risk suggesting to your peers that you dissent on the others, making you out as a bad person. Now, I think that's a really interesting point to raise because for me, it is true. It does describe how lots of people think, especially in the leftist camp. They are saying basically, we have menu A and menu B. Just who do you want to be associated with? So that's what you should believe. And I think that it's a bad thing to think this way because when we're talking about all sorts of topics, the first thing we need to do is to examine each topic on its own, not just by herd mentality and tribalism. Who thinks this? I like them, so I will think that. Who doesn't? I don't like them. I won't believe that.
I agree that most people aren't thinking in that manner. I will say that for a lot of people, especially those who place themselves on the intersectional left, I think a lot of them are either not willing or not capable of disaggregating all of these differences because it's either a function of the brainwashing that many of them have received since birth or the emotional neuroticism that a lot of them suffer from, that if you point out these contradictions, it causes them definitely an emotional, almost a physical distress to have to consider that their entire worldview is based upon a mountain of contradictions. I think a lot of people's worldviews are based on massive contradictions that they'll never have to square in their own lifetimes. And that's why I think a lot of people aren't capable of disaggregating these problems because they have based so much of their identity and so much of their personal pride in being able to say, I'm an intersectional social justice advocate, is probably how they would describe themselves as, or I'm an activist. They don't want to separate these ideas.
Sorry, but I was going to say, yeah, they've got a lot of sunk costs. Also, these people aren't that cognitively sharp. So if you hand a midwit a kind of coherent programming that gives them a direct path to power, but also the present political paradigm is very vulnerable to its charges.
That also sounds smart to them.
Yeah, exactly. They're cognitive misers, so they're just going to adopt it and hopefully enrich themselves and make themselves feel better.
I think it's more an issue of character than an issue of intelligence, but of course there is, let's say,
there can be some overlap.
There can be overlaps, but I think that to a very large extent, this has been for decades a failing of a cultural sort, especially when it comes to education, and you could say parenting. On this, you know way more than I do, because there's a kind of progressive parenting or progressive education, I should say, within quotation marks. I don't think it is, which basically focuses a lot on emotions. And the whole idea is on letting people express their emotions, whatever these emotions are.
Well, it's trying to separate parenting from any kind of authoritarian force, because parenting and proper education is inherently something authoritarian, basically, because you are an authority over those who are lower than you on the hierarchy. Your children are people. They're basically, Thomas Sowell has a great quote about this, which is that every new generation is essentially a generation of barbarians that you have to educate into being civilized people. So if you recognize that you're going to behave in ways that we have been taught from birth by our own parents, oftentimes, who were also brought up in this culture, that that's repressive and therefore that's evil. The worst thing that you can do in our culture is to be repressive, even if that in the long term is going to be beneficial for the manners of behavior and thought that your children end up adopting.
Personally, I wouldn't use the word authoritarian, but I do think that you have a point when you're saying that it has to do a lot with authority.
Yeah, of course.
So it is imperative to foster the idea of discipline. And one of the manifestations of discipline in, let's say, a mature person has to do with controlling their emotions and showing self-control and examining something. What we're looking at right now, right here, is a generation of young people who are habituated into not doing that. And not only habituated into not doing that, but habituated into thinking that trying to do that is a form of internalized tyranny. We have all this nonsense coming from, the structuralism, post-structuralism, all this kind of, postmodern ways of viewing things that basically says reason is a bad thing. So any kind of exercise of discipline in our thinking is basically seen as a form of internalizing tyranny.
Well,
so the idea is to throw away the tyrant, destroy the tyrant, destroy reason.
Well,
let some toxic sentimentality win you over.
Well, one of the interesting things about that is we know from that, which was the museum that did the
Smithsonian.
Yeah, the Smithsonian poster on the elements of whiteness is the scientific method, and reason is considered to be one of the defining elements of whiteness. I would actually say that it's a defining characteristic of Western thinking. The Greeks developed it, and the Anglos in particular, especially during the era of the British Empire and the Victorians, were very dedicated to reason and empiricism. And they see that as one of the great tyrannical repressive forces of history, is the idea that if you let the white man exercise his reason, then you're going to get genocide, you're going to get apartheid, you're going to get colonialism. And so if you the idea is teach white kids not to be like that, to be more like the beautiful, noble savage who's in touch with his emotions and in touch with nature, even though that's completely ahistorical.
This has to do with emotional manipulation, because people who don't exercise reason in their thinking, and they usually appeal to emotion, they're more prone to emotional manipulation. So people who are really skilled at manipulating people emotionally have vested interests in putting forward their rhetoric.
Absolutely.
That's Christopher Rufo's phrase of a cluster B civilization, where the hierarchies that you have are kind of modeled on a maladaptive parenting style. Because a tyranny is a hierarchy with authority that's inattentive to the people under its duty of care. And when you have a tyrannical parent, what you have is a very strict, authoritative parent that doesn't pay attention to the emotional needs of the child. Instead, it brushes them off. So what happens is when those children grow up, they will either reject authority or seek absolute authority because that's been the model that they have, but they won't be able to process their own emotions. So they'll have tantrums like a 2-year-old at every single protest. And so that's why you're seeing, in various ways, also because of the inefficacy of the state to deal with this, about 40% of Gen Z in an Onward survey have said, we want a centralized military dictatorship, essentially, not for based reasons, but for cringe reasons. Very disappointing.
We want cringe Franco. We need cringe Franco.
So one of the ways in which irrationality manifests is in double standards. So I want to show you here some tweets that involve flags and monuments. And basically, I want to ask you, how many times have you heard people from Western countries saying, well, the flag is just a piece of fabric. You shouldn't care about it. It's just a piece of fabric. How many times have you heard this?
Well, they only say that because it's our flags they're talking about. Their own flags are the most sacred objects to ever exist.
Yeah. So I don't know who is here, and I have no idea, but there are Palestinian flags over, say, British monuments.
It's a war memorial on Armistice Day.
Yep. And it says erected to commemorate the glorious heroes of the Machine Gun Corps who fell in the Great War. And we have people who were trying to say, well, what's the fuss about? And they had pictures like that and say people climb on statues in London and other cities constantly. Always have done. This was about 15 years ago.
This typical retard sophistry, as I would describe it, where you go, well, this thing looks a bit like this other thing. So they're the exact same thing. This dog has 4 legs, is fluffy and it has a tail. This cat has 4 legs, is fluffy and has a tail. Yeah. So they're the exact same thing.
Well, you can tell it was 15 years ago because there's white people in London.
Shocking behavior.
Yeah, well, anyway, so here is where we say that context matters. And they seem to me to be not involved into making any sort of political statement.
Well, it's not even just a political statement. They're not involved in the direct ideological denigration of the thing that they're sitting on.
I think fundamentally they can't separate things qualitatively. They can only look at the general outline of something and get the impression from that. They can't look at the actual details.
And here we have another war memorial.
Well, this is in
with graffitis, and I think that the issue is, first of all, that this shouldn't happen. And what I want to say is that it is frightening to see how many people in Western societies think that this is okay. In the same way that they think that, let's say, disrespecting the flag of a Western country is no big issue.
It's also in Rochdale, where the grooming gangs were. So extra level of insult.
And let us see this in Australia. I found it just shows that
all of our war memorials all across the Anglosphere.
And let us look at this person here.
Oh, not snatching the UN flag off, of course. I mean, that is just... oh, there we go. No, he did. Okay, well, that's base.
This is just anti-flag. Being anti-flag.
Anyway. There is a particular flag they're not touching, but...
they've put up there themselves.
Yep.
Anyway, so... that's it. I think that this shouldn't happen. And it's frightening to think how many people within Western societies are okay with it.
Thanks very much for watching this segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did and want to find more of what we do, you can subscribe to our website for as little as £5 per month and get access to all of the premium videos that we do, including Bo's Epoch series, currently on episode 132, where the most recent episode he sat down with Godfrey Bloom to discuss the Great War. And if you sign up at the moment to the website through Stripe and use code BIRTHDAY, you can get 33% off of your first 3 month subscription. So take advantage of that while you can. Furthermore, if you'd like to follow Bo and see what he gets up to, then you can follow him on Twitter at HistoryBro1. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.